What's up, guys? K-Train Garage. Today we're going to change the brakes on a 2004 Toyota Corolla. We're going to do both the rear and the front brakes. A couple tools I want to make sure you have at a minimum. Got some small pliers, some small pry bars in case the clips or the pads don't want to come out. A 21mm socket for the lug nuts and a 14mm socket for the pad bracket. We're not going to change the rotor, so we only need to take the caliper bracket off and not the whole caliper, so we can just take 2 bolts out, and I'll show you that. I have a torque wrench to make sure we torque down the wheels, but not too far. And while we're doing this, we want to make sure we wear some protective glasses. And whenever we jack up one of the wheels, we want to make sure we support it with something other than just the jack. So we have a jack stand here. And also, don't want to let the wheels roll, so I got some wheel stops. You can use power tools, but this is basically the minimum that we're going to need. So let's get into it. Before we pick the car up, I'm going to loosen these lug nuts so I don't have to fight the transmission to get it loose. There's a jack point on the car. We can put our pedestal jack on to pick it up. I get the jack stand under the subframe just to make sure the car can't fall down without when the wheel's not on there. So now I can loosen these nuts, and it's not going to put a lot of pressure on the parking prowl in the transmission. This rotor's in pretty good shape. It has almost its full depth, and really doesn't have any lip or anything. No scratches. If you were examining to see how much brakes you have left, to see if you need brakes before you take it in for inspection or appraisal, anything, if you get a brake pad depth gauge, you see how much you have left. You can just stick it in there. In this case, the outside pad has 6mm. It's starting to get low. The inside pad on the caliper piston side is between 2 and 3mm. That's getting pretty low. That's why we're changing this. Now we're going to remove the 2 14mm bolts. These are what hold the caliper to the caliper bracket. When we do this, the pads will stay in the caliper bracket, and we can just hang the caliper up. They make them and sell them just for this. Brake hangers, caliper hangers, You just hang them on a spring. These are kind of nice because they're powder coated and they're yellow, so it's harder to forget them in the wheel well. If you don't have hangers, it's not a big deal, but you want to hang it with something. You don't want the caliper to dangle by the hydraulic line. It'll ruin the seals at the either end of the hydraulic line. I want to work to pry this pad out without hurting the rotor. I'm trying to make an effort not to have to replace this rotor because it has a lot of meat left. So I found a point of leverage between the bracket and the base of the shoe, the metal part of the shoe, not the wearing composite part of the shoe. Found a place of leverage to pry it out. And when I'm doing this, I'm not going to pry a whole bunch of one side at a time so it'll come out straight. Because this is pretty rusty. This car gets stored outside. This pad is symmetrical. Always want to take note of how this goes in case there's any asymmetry to the pads on either side, to make sure you put them in correctly so you get full life and full stopping power. Let's work on getting another pad out of there. A couple things I want to point out to you here as I put these pads back on. It was difficult to get these pads off. The noise reduction clips and the bracket, there was a lot of rust buildup. So I wire brushed it to get any of the scale off. This will make it easier to service next time, and it'll help with what I'm about to do. These Monroe brakes that I got for this car, they come with brake lubricant. Brake lubricant might seem kind of silly because the brakes are supposed to cause friction, right? Yeah, that's true. But we can minimize the rust on a sliding surface where the pad slides back and forth. If we put just a little bit of the lubricating oil on the noise reduction clips and on the edges of the pad. Make sure you don't use too much. It's to protect it, not for the oil to get everywhere. with the new noise reduction clips and the new pads installed. We're going to put the caliper back on, but the new pads are way thicker than the old one. The caliper piston is sticking out some. So if you get a C-clamp, or there's a couple different tools you can use, you can remedy that. I have this one. I can stick in the caliper and compress it all the way back to make sure that I can get this over the new full-size pad. All you need to do is make sure that the piston is all the way back in the housing. It might go further, but there's no reason to do that. So now the caliper should go back on. There we are. I had to straighten out the pads because the rotor was straight, because I put 2 lug nuts on to make sure the rotor was straight. One of the pads wasn't all the way in, but I was able to pull on it and get it straight because I know the rotor's not going anywhere because it's tightened down. So now I can line up the caliper, put those 2 14mm bolts back in. Okay. New brakes are on this side. Let's get the other side. Now we're on to the other side. I wanted to get you a little bit closer shot of what's going on here. So again, we need to take the caliper off. Let's see how tough it is for these brake pads to come off. The other ones are really difficult to get off. There we go. That seems loose enough now. With the pads off of here, the noise reducer clips should just come off. Now that that's out of there, you can clean this area where the brake pad slides to minimize it sticking. Okay, now we have those sliding surfaces cleaned up. We can do the same thing we did with the other side. And make sure the clips are on all the way. It should just slide right in. Okay, got the new noise reduction clips and pads in. They're in the groove where they go. So now we compress the caliper, put it back on. All right, get this wheel on here and let's do the back brakes. Now we're doing the rear driver's brakes. The difference here on this 2004 Corolla is drum brakes in the back. If the drum is stubborn, if the drum doesn't want to come off, this model has two tapped holes you can use to push the drum off. If you have two regular metric bolts, 125s laying around, you can thread them in and push it off that way. Before I try to push this off, I'm gonna let off on the emergency brake so I'm not pulling the shoes off with the drum. Okay, emergency brake let go. So now, once I know the drum, once these bolts are starting to touch on the wheel hub, I just do about 1 revolution each. Okay, that's starting to push off now. It's almost free. So this is pushed off. There's definitely a gap now. If I back off these bolts, that might actually remove any of the tension that's there, and then it should come off. Yep, there we go. So now we have access to the brake shoes. To get these brake shoes off, there's this pin you just have to turn and these caps come off. You have to take the bottom spring off and take the emergency brake and shoe spring off the top. Most of these drum brake systems are the same, but if you haven't seen them before, it's always good to take it apart and lay out the pieces in the order with the first piece furthest away from you, so then you have a pretty good idea of what goes where when you're putting it back together. So if this was new to me, I see the spring on the outside holding this lever, which is the adjustment bracket for the shoes. So pull this spring back and let it out, let it free. And this is probably going to be the last thing I put on, so I put it the furthest away. That spring was pretty tough to get off. So before I try to get deeper and get the other spring that's holding the top part of the shoes, maybe I should do the one on the bottom here. Taking this spring out should let the shoes pivot independently. I should be able to get more slack in there. So this is a smaller spring. It's the second thing I took off. Now it's going to be the second furthest thing away. So it looks like there's a straight side and a hook side to this. Looks like I want to do the hook side, which is near the extra bracket that's only on this side that is for the emergency brake. Okay, I held the shoe back so that I could just push the hook out of there. So this adjustment retainer fell off while I was doing that. That's probably going to have to be the next thing that I put on when I'm putting it back together. So these shoes should be free now. If I remove these springed clips here. Now there's nothing retaining the shoe on there. So yeah, bent hooked spring, and then this 90-degree bend in this spring. I'm going to want to put that back in the hole when I'm putting the shoe back on. It looks like that's the only way this 90-degree bend can go in there. So this shoe has an extra pin, and this shoe doesn't. And otherwise, the shoes only go on one way, where the adjustment arm is on the top. For your benefit, I also know that these shoes are the same, the front side shoe, but the rear emergency brake shoe, the pin is asymmetrical. The shoe goes on where the longer wide pin is on the inside, because that's what the emergency brake arm pivots on. So these only go on, these are supposed to go on that way. The head is bigger on these on purpose, so that you only put it on the way it's supposed to go on. So don't force it. As you can see, this front side pad is pretty low. So when this comes down, the bracket is still holding on to the emergency brake cable. To get the emergency brake cable off, if you pull back the outer sheath of this cable, this hook will come off. If you add more slack between the end of the nut and the sheath, like this. And then you just do the same thing when you need to put it back on. So before we take this off, let's remember the pin goes on top, the arm goes behind. To take this off, there's a retaining collar. You need to expand and push off the pin to get, we need to put this arm on the new shoe. Okay, I got the bracket off and the clip that holds it on. So the way this goes together, pin on the top, we see this like this. The hook goes this way to stay away from the shoe to hold the emergency brake cable. We put that on. And we put the retainer clip on. I'm going to squeeze it the whole way back on there. And then close the open end to make sure that doesn't come off. Okay, now the open end is squeezed, closed. So this shoe goes like this, but before we put that back on, let's rejoin it to the emergency brake cable. We pull the outer sheath back, and then we just put the cable in the loop. Okay, now the loop is back on between the sheath and the end of the emergency brake cable. We can put the shoe back on. To make sure you can picture it, the brake adjustment bar I want to bring it together a little bit, not a lot. But the brake adjustment bar goes in the big slot on either side of the shoe, and that's what adjusts the brakes as they wear. So this is how we want to get it back in there. We can put the right side back in without attaching anything else. Let's find that pin. Let's get this pin through the center hole of the shoe. And as we line this up here, make sure that this tab is in the slot of the brake cylinder so we can push it. As we check this here, we make sure the shoe is tight against this. It's gonna touch these bottom bolts. So I always make sure the bottom is tight against there so that we take a front side shoe, we'll take that shorter spring with the bend in it, we get it in here, we place this where this goes, and now make sure that tab of the shoe is behind this other piece. It should be behind, not in front of it, or the shoe's not going to be straight. So now that spring is laying in there, but the 90 degree is in there. So if I bring the tops of these shoes together, I should be able to put this spring back in this hole to hold the top side of the shoes together. I'm going to pick up the spring so that then I can grab it, get a good grab of it with the pliers so I can stretch it to get it in this hole here. Well, if we take that smaller spring and get the bottom held together, that might help me, because that's going to keep everything tight up top too. Okay. Okay, yeah. Got the tool in there now that pulled the top together. Now the top and bottom will stay together. So now I can do the emergency brake. So there should be enough room. I put one end of the adjustment rod in, then I can do the other. Let's see how that goes. It needs to go far enough back to go around the shoe and the emergency brake bracket. There we are. See, now the shoes have come closer together. Actually it fell out. We'll keep the wide side in there. I'll push the small side in. There we go. So now the adjustment bar, it's in both sides. So now if we slip this adjustment keeper back in, goes on that pin, and then we put that spring in the front, put the 90 degree in the far side, now if I just pull this spring into that hole, it'll all be held together. This is what this should look like. The arm is holding on to the teeth of the adjustment screw, and the spring is holding this, and it's all the way on the pin. Now we put the brakes in the center, the shoes in the center. This drum should go on, and if it spins freely, we're all set. Yeah, that was enough. We brought the adjustment rod back together enough. Now we put this together.